2 years after Officer Miller's conviction and death sentence, David Thompson stood at a podium in the Hart Senate office building in Washington, D.C., preparing to address a room full of lawmakers, military leaders, and civil rights advocates. The man who had once been shot simply for showing his military ID had become one of the most powerful voices for police reform in America. David's physical recovery had been remarkable, though he still walked with a slight limp and couldn't raise his left arm completely above his shoulder. But the emotional healing had taken much longer, and in many ways, he was still working through the trauma of that terrible night 2 years ago. "Senators, distinguished guests," David began, his voice clear and confident despite the magnitude of the audience before him. "I stand here today not just as a survivor of police violence, but as a voice for every service member who has ever felt unsafe in the country they swore to protect." The hearing was part of Congress's consideration of the Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson Police Accountability Act, groundbreaking legislation that would require federal oversight of police departments with patterns of misconduct and mandate enhanced training on bias and de-escalation techniques. Senator Janet Williams, the chairwoman of the Judiciary Committee, had been one of the strongest supporters of the legislation. As a former prosecutor herself, she understood how difficult it was to hold police officers accountable for their actions, and David's case had convinced her that federal intervention was necessary. "Lieutenant Colonel Thompson," Senator Williams said, "can you tell us how your experience has shaped your views on what needs to change in American law enforcement?" David took a moment to collect his thoughts, remembering the advice Rachel had given him that morning: "Just speak from the heart and tell them what you've learned." "Senator, before I was shot, I believed that police officers and military personnel were natural allies," David replied. "We both took oaths to serve and protect. But my experience taught me that some officers see the uniform differently than others. Some see a fellow protector, while others see a threat that needs to be neutralized." David's testimony lasted nearly an hour, during which he described not only his own experience, but also the dozens of military families who had contacted him with similar stories. Many service members had faced harassment, excessive force, or discriminatory treatment from police, but most had never reported these incidents out of fear or resignation. "The military teaches us to respect authority and follow orders," David explained to the senators. "But that same training can make us vulnerable when we encounter officers who abuse their authority. We need better protection for service members. And we need accountability for officers who target military personnel." Meanwhile, across the country in Virginia, the Fairfax County Police Department was undergoing the most comprehensive reform in its history. The federal oversight imposed after Miller's conviction had forced the department to examine every aspect of its operations, from hiring practices to training programs to disciplinary procedures. Chief Robert Patterson, who had remained in his position despite calls for his resignation, was working closely with federal monitors to implement changes that would prevent another tragedy like David's shooting. The process had been painful and expensive, but Patterson knew it was necessary. "We failed Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, and we failed our community," Chief Patterson admitted during a community meeting 6 months after Miller's sentencing. "But we're committed to doing better. We're implementing new training programs, new oversight procedures, and new accountability measures that will ensure this never happens again." The reforms included mandatory bias training for all officers, enhanced de-escalation techniques, and a new early warning system that would flag officers with patterns of complaints before they could escalate to violence. The department also established a new community oversight board with real power to investigate misconduct and recommend disciplinary action. Officer Lisa Rodriguez, who had been Miller's partner that night, had become an unexpected advocate for reform within the police department. Her testimony during Miller's trial had been crucial to his conviction, but it had also made her an outsider among many of her fellow officers. "Some of my colleagues think I betrayed the badge by testifying against Miller," Rodriguez told a group of police recruits during a training session on ethics and accountability. "But I think staying silent would have been the real betrayal." We took an oath to serve and protect, and that includes protecting innocent people from officers who abuse their authority. Rodriguez had been promoted to sergeant and was now in charge of training new officers on proper procedures during traffic stops. She used David's case as a teaching example, showing recruits the body camera footage and explaining how Miller's actions violated every principle of good policing. "Look at this footage," Rodriguez would tell each new class of recruits. "Lieutenant Colonel Thompson did everything right. He was polite, cooperative, and clearly identified himself as military personnel. There was absolutely no justification for Officer Miller's actions. This is what happens when we let bias and aggression override our training and our judgment." The impact of David's case extended far beyond Virginia. Police departments across the country were reviewing their own policies and procedures, trying to prevent similar incidents in their communities. Military bases were also taking new precautions, briefing service members on their rights during police encounters and providing resources for those who experienced harassment or abuse. General Patricia Hayes, who had become one of David's strongest supporters in the Pentagon, established a new office dedicated to protecting service members from civilian law enforcement misconduct. The office provided legal assistance, investigated complaints, and worked with local police departments to improve relations with military personnel. "Every service member deserves to feel safe in their own country," General Hayes explained during a Pentagon briefing. "Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's case showed us that we can't take that safety for granted. We have to be proactive in protecting our people and holding accountable those who would harm them." For David's family, the 2 years since the shooting had been a journey of healing and growth. Katie, now a senior in high school, had decided to study criminal justice in college with the goal of becoming a civil rights lawyer. She had been deeply affected by her father's experience and wanted to help other families who faced similar injustices. "Dad's shooting changed my whole perspective on what I want to do with my life," Katie told a reporter during an interview for a documentary about the case. "I used to want to be a doctor, but now I realize that fighting for justice might be even more important. There are too many people who don't have the resources or platform that my family had." Michael, David's son, had struggled more with the aftermath of the shooting. The teenager had developed anxiety and anger issues that required counseling and therapy. But with time and support, he had found ways to channel his emotions into positive action, volunteering with veterans organizations and speaking to other young people about the importance of standing up against injustice. Rachel had also found her voice as an advocate, particularly for military spouses and families who face discrimination. She had started a support group for families affected by police misconduct and regularly spoke at conferences about the ripple effects of these incidents on entire communities. "People think that once the trial is over and justice is served, everything goes back to normal," Rachel explained to a group of advocates. "But the truth is that trauma like this changes you forever. You have to find ways to use that change for something positive, or it will consume you." The most significant long-term impact of David's case was the passage of the Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson Police Accountability Act, which became law 8 months after Miller's conviction. The legislation established federal standards for police training, created a national database of officer misconduct, and provided federal funding for departments that met high standards of accountability and community relations. President Morrison signed the bill into law at a ceremony in the Rose Garden with David and his family standing beside him. The moment was emotional and historic, representing the first major federal police reform legislation in decades. "This law won't bring back the sense of safety that Lieutenant Colonel Thompson and his family lost that terrible night," President Morrison said during the signing ceremony. "But it will help prevent other families from experiencing the same trauma. It will make our communities safer and our police departments more accountable." As David stood in the Rose Garden, watching the president sign legislation that bore his name, he thought about how far he had come from that terrifying night when Officer Miller shot him for showing his military ID. The journey had been painful and difficult, but it had also shown him the power of speaking truth and demanding justice. Miller himself remained on death row, his appeals moving slowly through the court system. David rarely thought about his attacker anymore, choosing instead to focus on the positive changes that had emerged from his tragedy. He had learned that while one person's hatred and bias could cause tremendous harm, it was a Tuesday evening in September when Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson finished his meeting at the Pentagon. The 42-year-old Army officer had just spent 3 hours in briefings about upcoming deployment schedules. His green dress uniform was crisp and clean with 20 years of service ribbons displayed proudly on his chest. The Bronze Star medal caught the light as he walked to his car in the parking garage. David had been looking forward to getting home to his wife and 2 teenage kids. His daughter had a soccer game the next day, and his son needed help with a history project about World War II. These were the moments that mattered most to him. Being a father and husband when he wasn't serving his country. The drive from the Pentagon to his home in Virginia usually took about 40 minutes. David knew the route well since he had been making this trip almost daily for the past 3 years. He worked as a logistics coordinator, making sure soldiers overseas got the supplies they needed. It wasn't glamorous work, but David took pride in supporting troops who were far from home. As he drove through the suburban streets, David noticed how quiet everything seemed. Most people were already home from work, sitting down to dinner with their families. Street lights were just beginning to flicker on as the sun started to set. David turned on some classical music and relaxed into his seat. The meeting had gone well, and he felt good about the plans they had discussed. About 15 minutes into his drive, David noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. He looked down at his speedometer and saw he was going exactly the speed limit. His registration was current, and he hadn't done anything wrong that he could think of. Still, he pulled over to the side of the road like any law-abiding citizen. Officer Robert Miller had been patrolling this area for the past 2 hours. It had been a slow day with not much happening. When he saw the dark sedan with tinted windows, something made him decide to follow it. Miller had been a police officer for 15 years and considered himself good at spotting trouble. He ran the license plate through his system and found nothing suspicious, but decided to make a traffic stop anyway. As Miller approached the car, he could see the driver was a black man wearing what appeared to be a military uniform. This immediately put Miller on edge, though he couldn't explain exactly why. In his years on the force, Miller had developed certain assumptions about people that he rarely questioned. His hand instinctively moved closer to his weapon as he walked toward the driver's side window. David rolled down his window completely and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. This was something his father had taught him years ago. Always make sure police officers can see your hands and never make sudden movements. David had never had a bad experience with police, but he understood that being careful was always the smart choice. "Good evening, officer," David said in a calm, respectful tone. "Is there something I can help you with?" Miller's response was much more aggressive than David expected. "License and registration now," Miller barked, his voice harsh and demanding. "And keep your hands where I can see them." David was surprised by the officer's tone but remained calm. "Of course, sir. My license is in my wallet in my back pocket, and my registration is in the glove compartment. Is it okay if I reach for them?" "Slowly," Miller commanded, his hand now resting on his gun. Very slowly. David carefully reached for his wallet, moving deliberately so the officer could see exactly what he was doing. As he pulled out his military ID and driver's license, Miller's expression became even more hostile. David couldn't understand why showing his identification seemed to make things worse instead of better. "What's this?" Miller demanded, looking at the military ID with suspicion. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Thompson with the United States Army," David explained calmly. "I just finished a meeting at the Pentagon and I'm heading home to my family." Instead of showing respect for David's service, Miller seemed to become more agitated. "Yeah, right," he said with obvious disbelief. "Step out of the car." David's heart began to beat faster. This was not going the way he had expected at all. "Officer, may I ask what I'm being stopped for? I don't believe I was speeding or breaking any traffic laws." "I said step out of the car." Miller shouted, his voice rising to an almost angry level. "Don't make me tell you again." David took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. He had been in stressful situations before during his military service, and he knew that keeping a clear head was always the best approach. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I'm going to unbuckle my seatbelt now and step out of the vehicle." As David slowly got out of his car, Miller continued to act aggressively. "Put your hands on the hood of the car," he ordered. "Spread your legs." David complied with every instruction, even though he felt humiliated and confused. Cars were driving by, and he could see people looking at him as they passed. Here he was, a decorated army officer who had served his country with honor, being treated like a criminal for no apparent reason. "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate fully," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But could you please tell me what this is about? I genuinely don't understand what I've done wrong." Miller ignored his question and began searching David's car without permission. He pulled out gym clothes, work papers, and family photos, throwing everything around carelessly. David watched in dismay as his personal belongings were scattered. Across the ground, meanwhile, Miller's partner, Officer Lisa Rodriguez, had arrived as backup. She had worked with Miller for 2 years and had seen him in situations like this before. Something about his behavior tonight made her uncomfortable, but she wasn't sure what to do about it. She stood back and watched, hoping the situation would calm down soon. After several minutes of searching and finding absolutely nothing suspicious, Miller returned to where David was standing with his hands still on the car hood. "Where are you really coming from?" he demanded. "I told you, sir. I was at the Pentagon for military meetings. I can show you my building access card if that would help." "Sure you were," Miller said with a sneer. "And I suppose you're some kind of war hero, too." David felt a flash of anger but controlled himself. "I've served 3 tours overseas, sir. I'm proud of my service to this country." Miller laughed in a way that was clearly meant to be insulting. "Right. And what were you really doing in that fancy government building?" The situation was becoming more surreal by the minute. David couldn't believe he was being questioned about his military service and his legitimate work at the Pentagon. He began to realize that this officer was not going to listen to reason, no matter what he said or showed him. "Officer, with all due respect, I believe I have the right to know why I was stopped," David said, still trying to keep his voice calm despite his growing frustration. "You have the right to shut up and do what you're told." Miller shot back, moving closer to David in what felt like a threatening manner. Officer Rodriguez watched this exchange with growing concern. She had never seen Miller act quite this aggressively. During a routine traffic stop, especially when the person was clearly cooperating, she wondered if she should intervene somehow. But Miller was her senior partner, and she didn't want to create problems for herself. As the minutes ticked by, David realized this was not going to end well. The officer seemed determined to escalate the situation, no matter how cooperative he tried to be. 20 years of military training had taught him to read people and situations, and everything about this felt dangerous. He just hoped he would make it home safely to see his family again. The tension in the air was thick as David Thompson stood with his hands pressed against the hood of his car. Officer Miller paced back and forth behind him like a caged animal, clearly agitated about something that David couldn't understand. The whole situation felt like it was spinning out of control, and David's military training told him that danger was approaching fast. "I want to see that military ID again," Miller demanded suddenly, his voice sharp and hostile. "The real one." This time, David turned his head slightly, confused by the request. "Sir, I already showed you my military identification. It's right there in your hand along with my driver's license." "Don't get smart with me," Miller snapped back. "I think you're trying to pull something over on me. Nobody just drives around in a fancy uniform like that." Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably as she watched the exchange. She had seen the military ID herself when Miller first examined it, and it looked completely legitimate to her. The ribbons on David's uniform were clearly real, and everything about him suggested he was exactly who he claimed to be. But Miller seemed determined to find something wrong with the situation. David took a slow, deep breath and tried once more to explain. Officer, I understand you're just doing your job, but I really am a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. I work at the Pentagon every day. My wife is expecting me home for dinner, and my kids are probably wondering where I am. The mention of his family made David's chest tighten with emotion. His daughter Katie was probably finishing her homework right now, and his son Michael was likely playing video games in his room. His wife Rachel would be looking at the clock, wondering why he was running late. They had no idea that their husband and father was standing on the side of a road being treated like a criminal. Yeah, well, we'll see about that, Miller said with a cruel laugh. Why don't you reach into that car and get me some more identification? Something that proves you're really who you say you are. David hesitated for a moment. Something about the way Miller said this felt like a trap, but he couldn't figure out what kind of trap it might be. What would you like to see, sir? I have my Pentagon building access card in my wallet. Just reach in there and get it, Miller ordered, stepping back a few feet. His hand moved to rest on his weapon, and David noticed the gesture immediately. Officer Rodriguez saw it too, and alarm. Bells started going off in her head. She had never seen Miller draw his weapon during a routine traffic stop, and this situation didn't seem to warrant that level of force. The man they had stopped was clearly unarmed and had been cooperating fully from the beginning. Officer Miller, Rodriguez said quietly, trying to get his attention without escalating things further. Maybe we should just run his information through the system and verify his identity that way. Miller shot her a look that could have melted steel. I know how to do my job, Rodriguez. Just stay back and let me handle this. David could feel the situation becoming more dangerous by the second. Every instinct he had developed during his 20 years of military service was telling him that something very bad was about to happen. But he also knew that he had to comply with the officer's requests, no matter how unreasonable they seemed. I'm going to reach into my car now to get my Pentagon ID card, David announced clearly, making sure both officers could hear him. It's in my wallet, which is in my jacket pocket inside the vehicle. Miller nodded but kept his hand on his gun. Nice and slow, no sudden movements. David leaned into his car through the open door, moving as deliberately as possible. He could see his jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat where he had placed it when he left the Pentagon. The wallet was in the inside pocket, just where it always was. As he reached for it, David thought about how many times he had done this exact same thing, reaching for his ID to show security guards, gate personnel, and other officials who needed to verify his identity, but something went wrong in that moment. Maybe it was the way the light reflected off his Pentagon access card as he pulled it from his wallet. Maybe it was the quick motion of his hand as he turned to show the ID to Officer Miller. Or maybe Miller had already made up his mind about what was going to happen, regardless of what David did or didn't do. Gun! He's got a gun! Miller shouted suddenly, drawing his weapon with lightning speed. David's eyes went wide with shock and confusion. No, it's just my ID card, he called out, holding up the plastic identification card so Miller could see it clearly, but Miller was beyond listening to reason. His weapon was already pointed at David, and his finger was moving toward the trigger. Time seemed to slow down as David realized what was about to happen. In his mind, he could see his wife's face and hear his children's laughter. He thought about all the missions he had survived overseas, all the dangerous situations he had navigated safely, only to find himself in mortal danger on a quiet street in his own country. Please don't shoot, David shouted, dropping the ID card and raising both hands high above his head. I'm unarmed. I'm just trying to show you my identification. Officer. Rodriguez watched in horror as the situation spiraled completely out of control. She could see clearly that David was holding nothing more threatening than a plastic ID card. But Miller seemed to be in some kind of altered state where he couldn't process what was really happening. Miller, stop! She yelled, but it was too late. The first shot rang out like thunder, echoing off the buildings and houses in the quiet neighborhood. David felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing against his car. The pain was immediate and intense, but he was still conscious and aware of what was happening. "I'm hit," David gasped, pressing his hand against his shoulder where blood was already beginning to flow. "Why did you shoot me? I wasn't doing anything wrong." But Miller wasn't finished. His training had taught him to neutralize threats completely, and in his mind, David was still dangerous. The second shot hit David in the chest, knocking him to the ground beside his car. The third shot went wide, striking the car door and shattering. The window. Officer Rodriguez immediately called for emergency medical assistance, her hands shaking as she spoke into her radio. "We need paramedics right now. Officer involved shooting. One person down." David lay on the asphalt, struggling to breathe and trying to understand what had just happened to him. The ID card that had started this whole nightmare was lying just a few feet away, clearly visible to anyone who cared to look at it. His military uniform was now stained with blood, and he could feel his strength fading fast. "My family," he whispered, thinking about Rachel and the kids. "Someone needs to call my family." In the distance, sirens began to wail as emergency vehicles raced toward the scene. Neighbors started coming out of their houses to see what all the commotion was about. Some of them had heard the shots and were already pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Officer Rodriguez knelt beside David, trying to apply pressure to his wounds while they waited for the paramedics to arrive. "Help is coming," she told him. "Just hang in there." David looked up at her with eyes that were already starting to fade. "Tell my kids I love them," he said softly. "Tell them their daddy was just trying to come home." As the paramedics worked frantically to save David's life, Miller stood off to the side, already beginning to construct his version of events. In his mind, he had done what any reasonable officer would do when faced with an armed suspect. The fact that David had never been armed at all was a detail that Miller was already pushing out of his consciousness. The ambulance screamed through the night toward the hospital, carrying a wounded soldier who had survived war zones overseas only, to be shot down on a peaceful street in America. Behind them, the investigation was just beginning. At exactly 11:47 p.m., General Patricia Hayes was sound asleep in her Arlington home when her secure phone started buzzing urgently on her nightstand. As the commanding officer overseeing personnel operations at the Pentagon, she was used to late-night calls, but something about the insistent tone made her heart race even before she answered. "General Hayes speaking," she said, instantly alert despite having been deep in sleep just moments before. "Ma'am, this is Colonel James Park from the Pentagon Operations Center. I'm sorry to wake you, but we have an emergency situation involving one of our officers. Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson was shot by police tonight during a traffic stop. He's currently in surgery at Georgetown University Hospital." General Hayes sat up in bed so quickly that she felt dizzy. David Thompson was one of her most reliable officers, a man she had personally recommended for several important assignments over the past 3 years. He was exactly the kind of soldier that made her proud to serve in the military, dedicated, honest, and completely professional in everything he did. "What are his injuries?" she asked, already reaching for her uniform in the closet. Sleep was no longer a possibility. "2 gunshot wounds, ma'am. One to the shoulder and one to the chest. The doctors say he's in critical but stable condition." The shooting occurred approximately 2 hours ago in Virginia, about 20 minutes from the Pentagon. General Hayes felt her stomach drop. David had been at the Pentagon earlier that day for routine briefings. She remembered seeing him in the hallway, looking sharp in his dress uniform and talking about his daughter's soccer game. Now he was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. "Have we contacted his family?" she asked, her military training kicking in even as her emotions churned. "Yes, ma'am. His wife Rachel is at the hospital now with their 2 children. The Red Cross helped coordinate getting them there safely." "Good. What do we know about the circumstances of the shooting?" Colonel Park's voice became more tense as he continued. "Initial reports suggest this was an unprovoked attack during a routine traffic stop. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson was apparently shot while trying to show his military identification to the officer. There's body camera footage and there were witnesses." General Hayes closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In her 30 years of military service, she had seen soldiers injured and killed in combat zones around the world. But the idea that one of her officers had been shot by police while simply trying to drive home from work filled her with a rage she rarely allowed herself to feel. "I want a full briefing in my office in 1 hour," she ordered. "Contact the Pentagon legal team immediately. And get me a direct line to the Secretary of Defense. He needs to know about this right away." As General Hayes drove through the empty streets toward the Pentagon, her mind raced with questions and concerns. How could a decorated Army officer be shot while showing his ID to police? What kind of training did these officers receive? And most importantly, what was the military going to do to make sure this never happened again to one of their people? Meanwhile, across the Potomac River, Defense Secretary James Morrison was having his own emergency meeting with his senior staff. The 58-year-old former Marine had been in government service for over a decade, but he had never dealt with a situation quite like this one. "Gentlemen, what we have here is not just an attack on one of our officers," Morrison said to the room full of worried-looking officials. "This is an attack on the uniform itself. When police shoot a soldier who is clearly identified as military personnel, they are shooting at everything we stand for as an institution." Morrison's chief of staff, a sharp woman named Janet Cooper, looked up from her notes. "Sir, we've already been contacted by 3 different news organizations. This story is going to be front-page news by tomorrow morning." "Good," Morrison replied firmly. "I want the whole country to know what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Thompson. And I want everyone to know that the Department of Defense will not tolerate this kind of treatment of our personnel." Within the Pentagon, word of the shooting spread quickly through the building's maze of corridors and offices. Military personnel who worked late shifts stopped their conversations to discuss what they had heard. Many of them knew David personally, and they couldn't believe that someone so professional and respected had become the victim of police violence. Captain Lisa Shunn, who worked in the same department as David, was one of the first to hear the news. She had been finishing up some paperwork when her supervisor called her into his office to tell her what had happened. "I just talked to David this afternoon," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He was excited about his son's history project. How could this happen to someone like him?" The supervisor, a veteran officer named Major Robert Williams, shook his head sadly. "I don't know, Lisa, but I guarantee you that the Pentagon is going to move heaven and earth to get justice for David and his family." As the night progressed, more and more military officials became involved in the response. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office began preparing statements for the media. The legal department started researching federal laws that might apply to the case. And senior commanders began making phone calls to ensure that David's family had everything they needed during this crisis. At Georgetown University Hospital, Rachel Thompson sat in the surgical waiting room with her teenage children, Katie and Michael. The kids were scared and confused, trying to understand how their father could go from a normal day at work to fighting for his life in a hospital bed. "Mom, is Dad going to be okay?" Katie asked for the 10th time, her eyes red from crying. Rachel pulled her daughter close and tried to sound more confident than she felt. "The doctors are doing everything they can, honey. Your father is strong, and he's been through difficult situations before." Michael, who was usually quiet and reserved, looked up at his mother with an expression that seemed far too old for his 16 years. "Why did the police shoot Dad?" "He wasn't doing anything wrong." Rachel didn't have a good answer for that question. She had been married to David for 18 years, and she knew him better than anyone. He was the most law-abiding person she had ever met. He followed every rule, respected every authority figure, and always taught his children to cooperate with police officers. The idea that he had been shot while trying to show his military ID was almost impossible for her to accept. Around 3 a.m., General Hayes arrived at the hospital with 2 other Pentagon officials. She found Rachel and the children in the waiting room and immediately went over to introduce herself. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm General Hayes, your husband's commanding officer. I want you to know that the entire Pentagon family is praying for David and supporting your family during this time." Rachel looked up at the general with gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you, General. David always spoke very highly of you. He was proud to serve under your command." The pride was mutual," General Hayes replied. "David is one of the finest officers I've ever worked with, and I want you to know that we are going to do everything in our power to make sure the people responsible for this are held accountable." As dawn approached, the Pentagon's response machine was in full swing. Press releases were being drafted, legal strategies were being discussed, and high-level phone calls were being made to officials throughout the government. The military had awakened a sleeping giant, and everyone involved knew that this case was going to become a major national issue. Secretary Morrison stood at his office window, watching the sun rise over Washington, D.C., and made a decision that would change everything. The Department of Defense was going to throw its full weight behind seeking justice for David Thompson, no matter what it took or how long it required. By Wednesday morning, the story had exploded across every news channel and social media platform in America. The headline, "Army Officer Shot by Police While Showing Military ID," was trending on every major website, and the public reaction was swift and intense. Jennifer Walsh was having her morning coffee when she saw the news alert pop up on her phone. As a mother of two and a military spouse herself, the story hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her husband was deployed overseas, and the thought that he could come home safely from a war zone only to be shot by police in their own neighborhood was terrifying. "This could have been my husband," she whispered to herself, scrolling through the details of David's shooting. Within minutes, she was sharing the story with her friends and posting about it on social media. Her message was simple but powerful. If this can happen to a decorated Army officer in uniform, it can happen to anyone. Across the country, millions of people were having similar reactions. The video footage from Officer Rodriguez's body camera had been released by the police department, and it was devastating to watch. The clip showed David calmly cooperating with every instruction, clearly identifying himself as military personnel, and then being shot while trying to show his Pentagon ID card. Dr. Amanda Foster, a civil rights lawyer in Atlanta, was in her office preparing for court when her assistant rushed in with news about the shooting. Amanda had spent her entire career fighting cases of police brutality, but something about David's case felt different and urgent. "Get me everything you can find about this case," she told her assistant. "Flight records, hospital reports, military service records, everything. We need to understand exactly what happened and why." Amanda had seen too many cases where police officers claimed they feared for their lives when shooting unarmed citizens. But this case was particularly outrageous because David had been in full military uniform, clearly identified himself as an Army officer, and had done absolutely nothing threatening or suspicious. Meanwhile, in Virginia, the Fairfax County Police Department was dealing with a crisis unlike anything they had experienced before. Chief Robert Patterson had been with the department for 25 years, and he knew immediately that this case was going to define his legacy as a law enforcement leader. How did this happen? Chief Patterson asked his senior staff during an emergency meeting. "How did one of my officers shoot an Army lieutenant colonel who was showing his military ID?" Detective Carol Murphy, who had been assigned to lead the internal investigation, looked uncomfortable as she delivered her preliminary findings. "Chief, the body camera footage is very clear. Officer Miller shot Lieutenant Colonel Thompson without justification. There's no evidence that Thompson posed any threat whatsoever." Chief Patterson felt sick to his stomach. He had tried to build a police department that served the community with honor and integrity. Now, one of his officers had potentially destroyed all of that progress with a few terrible decisions. "What do we know about Miller's background?" the chief asked. Detective Murphy flipped through her notes. "That's where this gets even worse, sir. Miller has had 7 complaints filed against him in the past 5 years. 3 of them involved allegations of racial bias, and 2 involved excessive use of force. None of them resulted in serious disciplinary action." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The department had ignored multiple warning signs about Miller's behavior, And now a decorated military officer was lying in a hospital bed because of their failure to act. Outside the police station, protesters had already begun gathering. Local resident Maria Santos was one of the first to arrive, carrying a sign that read, "Justice for Lieutenant Colonel Thompson." As a teacher in the community, Maria had always tried to teach her students to respect both the military and law enforcement. But David's shooting made her question everything she thought she knew about police accountability. "This man served our country for 20 years, Maria told a reporter from the local news station. "He survived 3 tours of duty overseas, and then he gets shot by police while driving home from work. How is that acceptable in America?" The crowd grew larger throughout the day as word spread through social media and news coverage. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and concerned citizens all came together to demand justice for David and his family. Vietnam veteran Frank Rodriguez had driven 3 hours from North Carolina to join the protest. At 72 years old, Frank had seen a lot of injustice in his lifetime, but David's shooting had motivated him to take action in a way he hadn't felt in years. "I wore the uniform for 2 years in Vietnam," Frank told anyone who would listen. "When you put on that uniform, you're making a promise to defend this country. The least we can do is make sure the people wearing that uniform are safe when they come home." Inside the FBI field office in Washington, D.C., Special Agent Patricia Collins was assembling a team to investigate the shooting as a potential federal civil rights violation. Patricia had handled dozens of police misconduct cases during her 15-year career, but the evidence in David's case was unusually clear-cut. "This isn't going to be a difficult case to prove," she told her team during their first briefing. "The question is whether we can build a strong enough case to ensure real consequences for the officer involved." Patricia's team immediately began collecting evidence from multiple sources. They subpoenaed Miller's personnel files, interviewed witnesses who had seen the shooting, and coordinated with military investigators who were conducting their own parallel investigation. At the Pentagon, General Hayes was dealing with calls from reporters, members of Congress, and military families who were concerned about the safety of service members. She had been in meetings almost non-stop since David was shot, and the pressure was enormous. "General, we're getting calls from military spouses all over the country," her aide reported. "They want to know what the Pentagon is doing to protect service members from police violence." General Hayes understood their concerns completely. If a lieutenant colonel in full uniform could be shot while showing his military ID, then every service member was potentially at risk. The military needed to send a clear message that attacks on their personnel would not be tolerated. "Draft a statement for immediate release," she ordered. "Make it clear that the Department of Defense expects full accountability for this shooting, and that we will use every resource at our disposal to ensure justice is served." Meanwhile, at Georgetown University Hospital, David was slowly beginning to recover from his surgeries. The doctors had managed to repair the damage from both gunshot wounds, but he would need months of physical therapy to regain full use of his shoulder and arm. Rachel had barely left his bedside since the shooting. Friends and family members had been rotating shifts to help with Katie and Michael, but Rachel wanted to be there when David woke up fully from the anesthesia. When David finally opened his eyes and looked around the hospital room, the first thing he saw was Rachel's worried face looking down at him. "Hey," he whispered, his voice weak from the medications. "Hey yourself," Rachel replied, tears streaming down her face. "You scared us pretty badly there." David tried to sit up but immediately felt pain shooting through his chest and shoulder. "What happened?" "I remember the traffic stop, and then—" His voice trailed off as the memories came flooding back. "The police officer shot you," Rachel said gently, "but you're going to be okay. The doctors say you'll make a full recovery." David closed his eyes and tried to process what his wife was telling him. He had been shot by a police officer while trying to show his military identification. It seemed impossible, but the pain in his body told him it was all too real. "Are Katie and Michael okay?" he asked. "They're fine. They're worried about you, but they're fine. And David, there are a lot of people fighting for justice for you." The Pentagon, the FBI, civil rights organizations, everyone is demanding accountability. David nodded weakly. He didn't want to be the center of a national controversy, but he understood that his case was about more than just what happened to him. It was about whether America would protect the people who had sworn to protect America. 3 weeks after the shooting, District Attorney Rebecca Sullivan sat in her office staring at a stack of evidence that made her both angry and determined. In her 12 years as a prosecutor, she had handled many difficult cases, but rarely had she seen evidence this clear-cut in a police shooting case. Rebecca had grown up in a military family. Her father was a Navy veteran, and her brother currently served in the Air Force. When she watched the body camera footage of David Thompson being shot while showing his military ID, she felt a personal connection that went beyond her professional responsibilities. "This case is going to define my career," she told her chief assistant, Prosecutor Kevin Martinez, as they reviewed the evidence for the 100th time. "And honestly, that's fine with me. Some cases are worth everything you can give them." The evidence against Officer Miller was overwhelming. The body camera footage showed David cooperating fully and clearly identifying himself as military personnel. Witness statements from people who lived nearby confirmed that David never posed any threat. And most damning of all, Miller's own personnel file revealed a pattern of aggressive behavior and racial bias that the police department had ignored for years. "Look at this," Rebecca said, pointing to a report from 2 years earlier. Miller was accused of using racial slurs during an arrest, and the department gave him a written warning. Just a written warning. Then 6 months later, another complaint about excessive force. Again, minimal consequences. Kevin shook his head as he read through the file. It's like they were just waiting for something terrible to happen. How many warning signs did they need? Rebecca had made the decision to charge Miller with first-degree murder, which was unusual in police shooting cases. Most prosecutors chose lesser charges like manslaughter or second-degree murder, arguing that proving premeditation in the heat of the moment was too difficult. But Rebecca believed Miller's actions showed clear intent to harm David. The way Miller escalated this situation from the very beginning shows planning, she explained to her team. He saw a black man in a military uniform and decided to create a confrontation. When David tried to comply with his demands, Miller shot him. Anyway, that's not split-second decision-making. That's deliberate violence. Meanwhile, the Pentagon had assigned 2 of their top military lawyers to work alongside Rebecca's team, Colonel Janet Foster and Major Anthony. Rivera had flown in from Washington, D.C. to ensure that the military's interests were properly represented. In the case, Colonel Foster had prosecuted military personnel for various crimes during her 20-year career, but she had never worked on a case where a civilian had attacked a service member. The legal implications were complex, and she wanted to make sure that David's rights as a military officer were fully protected. From the military's perspective, this is an attack on the uniform itself, Colonel Foster explained to Rebecca during one of their planning meetings. When someone shoots a service member who is clearly identified as military personnel, they're attacking the institution we represent. Major Rivera nodded in agreement. We've received calls from military families all over the country. People are scared that what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Thompson could happen to their loved ones. This case is about more than just seeking justice for one officer. It's about protecting everyone who wears the uniform. The defense team for Officer Miller was led by veteran criminal defense attorney Patricia Walsh, who had built her reputation defending police officers in controversial cases. Patricia knew this case would be incredibly difficult to win, but she believed every person deserved a strong legal defense, even in the most challenging circumstances. My client made a mistake, Patricia admitted to her team during their first strategy meeting. But we need to convince the jury that it was a mistake born from fear and poor training, not from racial hatred or premeditation. Patricia's strategy was to argue that Miller had been inadequately trained by his department and that he genuinely believed David posed a threat in the moment when he fired his weapon. She planned to bring in expert witnesses who would testify about the stress and confusion that police officers face during traffic stops, but even Patricia knew that Miller's personnel file was going to be a major problem for the defense. The pattern of complaints and the department's failure to address his behavior made it difficult to argue that the shooting was an isolated incident. The prosecution is going to paint a picture of a racist officer who was looking for trouble, she told Miller during one of their preparation sessions. We need to be ready to counter that narrative with evidence of your years of service and the difficult situations you've handled professionally. Miller himself seemed to be struggling with the reality of his situation. In his mind, he had done what any reasonable officer would do when faced with what he perceived as a threat. The fact that David had never actually posed any danger was something Miller found difficult to accept. I saw him reaching for something, Miller insisted during his interviews with Patricia. In that moment, I thought he was going for a weapon. I had to protect myself. Patricia tried to be patient with her client, but she knew the body camera footage told a different story. David had clearly announced he was reaching for his ID, and the plastic Pentagon access card was visible in his hand when Miller opened. As news of the first-degree murder charges spread, public reaction was intense and divided. Military families and civil rights advocates applauded the decision to pursue the strongest possible charges, while police organizations criticized the prosecutor for what they saw as an overreach. Police union Representative Thomas Baker held a press conference outside the courthouse to defend Miller and criticize the charges. Officer Miller was doing his job in a difficult and dangerous situation, Baker declared. Charging him with first-degree murder sends a message to every police officer that they can't defend themselves when they feel threatened. But veterans advocate Linda Rodriguez had a very different perspective. At her own press conference, she read a statement from David's military unit. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson served his country with honor for 20 years. He survived 3 combat deployments and earned numerous medals for his bravery. The idea that he posed a threat to anyone while showing his military identification is absurd and offensive. The case was also drawing attention from legal experts across the country. Professor William Chin from Georgetown Law School had been following the case closely and believed it could set important precedents for how police officers are held accountable for their actions. What makes this case unusual is the quality of the evidence, Professor Chun explained to his students. Usually in police shooting cases, there are questions about what really happened. But here we have clear video footage, multiple witnesses, and extensive documentation of the officer's problematic behavior. It's going to be very difficult for the defense to create reasonable doubt. As the legal teams prepared for trial, David continued his recovery at home with his family. The physical wounds were healing, but the emotional trauma was more difficult to address. Simple activities like driving to the store or interacting with police officers in routine situations now filled him with anxiety. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I had died that night, David told Rachel during one of their evening conversations. Katie and Michael would have grown up knowing their father was killed while trying to show his military ID. How do you explain something like that to children? Rachel held his hand and tried to provide comfort, but she was struggling with her own emotions about the case. The woman who had always taught her children to respect law enforcement now found herself questioning whether police officers could be trusted to treat her family fairly. We're going to get through this, she promised David. And maybe something good will come from all this pain. Maybe other families won't have to go through what we've experienced. As the trial date approached, both sides knew they were preparing for a case that would be watched by the entire nation. The outcome would send a message about whether America truly valued the service members who had dedicated their lives to protecting the country. The courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia had never seen anything quite like the media circus that surrounded Officer Miller's trial. News vans lined the streets for blocks, and reporters from every major television network were broadcasting live updates throughout the day. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled with a mixture of military families, civil rights activists, police officers, and curious citizens who had followed the case since David's shooting 6 months earlier. Judge Helen Morrison, a no-nonsense veteran of 23 years on the bench, had handled many high-profile cases before. But she knew this trial would test all of her skills in maintaining order and ensuring fairness. As she looked out at the packed courtroom on the first day of proceedings, she could feel the tension in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Morrison addressed the room, "this trial will be conducted with dignity and respect for all parties involved. I will not tolerate any disruptions or outbursts, regardless of your feelings about this case." District Attorney Rebecca Sullivan stood to deliver her opening statement, and the courtroom fell completely silent. She had practiced these words dozens of times, but standing in front of the jury with David and his family watching from the gallery made the moment feel incredibly powerful. 6 months ago, Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson was driving home from work at the Pentagon when his life changed forever, Rebecca began, her voice clear and steady. He was a decorated Army officer with 20 years of service to his country. He had survived 3 combat tours overseas. He was a loving husband and father who just wanted to get home to have dinner with his family. Rebecca walked closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 jurors who would decide Miller's fate. But Officer Robert Miller saw something different when he looked at Lieutenant Colonel Thompson. Despite the military uniform, despite the clear identification, despite the complete cooperation, Miller saw a threat that existed only in his own mind. The prosecutor spent the next 45 minutes laying out the evidence against Miller. She described his history of complaints, his aggressive behavior during the traffic stop, and most importantly, the moment when he chose to shoot an unarmed man who was simply trying to show his Pentagon ID card. This was not a split-second decision, made in the heat of the moment, Rebecca concluded. This was the predictable result of years of unchecked aggression and racial bias. Officer Miller didn't make a mistake that night. He made a choice. When it came time for the defense, Attorney Patricia Walsh faced an uphill battle that she knew would require all of her experience and skill. Her opening statement focused on the dangers that police officers face every day and the split second. Decisions they must make to protect themselves and the public. Officer Miller is a human being who made a terrible mistake under extraordinary pressure, Patricia told the jury. For 15 years, he served his community with dedication and courage. On the night in question, he believed he was facing a life-threatening situation, and he reacted the way his training had taught him to react. Patricia's strategy was to humanize Miller and convince the jury that his actions, while tragic, were not the result of racial hatred or premeditation. She planned to argue that the police department's inadequate training and policies had failed both Miller and David that night. The first week of testimony focused on David's military service and character. General Patricia Hayes took the stand to describe David's exemplary record and his reputation as one of the finest officers she had ever commanded. Her testimony was emotional and powerful, and several jurors appeared moved by her words. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson represents everything that is best about the United States Army, General Hayes testified. He is exactly the kind of person we want wearing our uniform and representing our country around the world. Colonel Janet Foster from the Pentagon legal team also testified about David's service record, reading from commendations and performance evaluations that painted a picture of a soldier who had consistently gone above and beyond the call of duty. But the most powerful testimony of the first week came from David himself. Walking slowly to the witness stand with the help of a cane, he still showed the effects of his injuries 6 months after the shooting. His left shoulder was visibly stiff, and he moved carefully to avoid aggravating his chest wounds, Rachel Thompson watched from the gallery as her husband was sworn in, fighting back tears as she saw how much the shooting had changed him. The confident, strong man she had married was still there, but the trauma of that night had left its mark on both his body and his spirit. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Rebecca Sullivan requested. "Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson, United States Army," David replied, his voice strong despite the obvious emotion he was feeling. Rebecca guided David through his testimony carefully, starting with his military service and the events leading up to the shooting. David described his day at the Pentagon, his eagerness to get home to his family, and his complete confusion when Officer Miller began treating him like a criminal. When Officer Miller asked to see my military identification, I was actually relieved. David testified. I thought that once he saw my Pentagon ID card, he would realize there had been some kind of misunderstanding and let me go home to my family. The courtroom was absolutely silent as David described the moment when Miller shot him. Several jurors leaned forward in their seats, and at least two appeared to be fighting back tears. I remember holding up my ID card and saying, "Please don't." "Shoot," David continued, his voice breaking slightly. I couldn't understand why he was pointing a gun at me. I had done everything he asked me to do. Under cross-examination, Patricia Walsh tried to suggest that David's movements might have appeared threatening to Officer Miller, but David's calm and straightforward answers made it difficult for her to shake his credibility. "Mr. Thompson, is it possible that in the darkness and confusion of that night, your movements could have been misinterpreted?" Patricia asked. "Ma'am, I was wearing a full military dress uniform with reflective elements," David replied. "The street was well lit, and I clearly announced what I was doing before I reached for my ID. There was no confusion about my identity or my intentions." The second week of testimony brought Officer Rodriguez to the stand as a prosecution witness. As Miller's partner that night, her testimony was crucial to understanding what had really happened during the traffic stop. Rodriguez appeared nervous as she took the oath, knowing that her testimony could destroy the career of a fellow officer. But she also knew that she had sworn to tell the truth, and the truth was that Miller's actions that night had been completely unjustified. "Did Lieutenant Colonel Thompson do anything that night that made you fear for your safety?" Rebecca asked. "No, ma'am," Rodriguez replied firmly. "Lieutenant Colonel Thompson was completely cooperative throughout the entire encounter. He did exactly what Officer Miller asked him to do." "In your opinion, did Officer Miller have any justification for using deadly force?" Rodriguez paused for a moment, understanding the weight of her answer. "No, ma'am. In my opinion, there was no justification for shooting Lieutenant Colonel Thompson." Patricia Walsh's cross-examination of Rodriguez was intense as she tried to suggest that Rodriguez hadn't been in a position to see everything that happened or understand Miller's perspective. But Rodriguez held firm to her account of events. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by testimony from use-of-force experts who analyzed the body camera footage frame by frame. Dr. William Carter, a former police chief turned academic, testified that Miller's actions violated every principle of proper police procedure. "Officer Miller escalated this situation from the very beginning," Dr. Carter explained to the jury. "Instead of de-escalating the encounter and verifying Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's identity, he chose to treat a cooperative citizen as a threat. This represents a complete failure of police training and judgment." As the trial progressed, it became clear that the evidence against Miller was overwhelming. The body camera footage, witness testimony, and expert analysis all pointed to the same conclusion. An unarmed, cooperative military officer had been shot without justification by a police officer with a documented history of aggressive and biased behavior, but Patricia Walsh wasn't giving up without a fight. She brought in her own experts to testify about the stress and uncertainty that police officers face during traffic stops, arguing that Miller's actions, while tragic, were the result of inadequate training rather than criminal intent. The battle for Miller's fate was far from over, but the prosecution had built a strong case that would be difficult for the defense to overcome. After 3 weeks of intense testimony, the jury began their deliberations on a Friday afternoon. The 12 men and women who would decide Officer Miller's fate had heard every piece of evidence, watched the body camera footage dozens of times, and listened to expert witnesses from both sides. Now they faced the difficult task of determining whether Miller was guilty of first-degree murder or if his actions that night could be justified in some way. Jury foreman Thomas Anderson, a retired school principal with no military background, had been chosen by his fellow jurors to guide their discussions. As they settled into the deliberation room, Thomas could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one police officer or one Army lieutenant colonel. This case would send a message about justice and accountability that would be heard across the entire country. Before we start talking about guilt or innocence, Thomas told the other jurors. "I think we need to be clear about what we actually saw and heard during this trial. Let's go through the evidence piece by piece." The jury spent their first 2 hours reviewing the body camera footage again, pausing at key moments to discuss what they were seeing. Juror number 7, a young mother named Lisa Chun, found herself getting emotional as she watched David being shot while holding up his Pentagon ID card. "I keep thinking about his children," Lisa said quietly. "How do you explain to kids that their father was shot by police while trying to show his military identification? It just doesn't make sense." But juror number 3, a retired factory worker named Robert Williams, urged the others to focus on what Officer Miller was thinking in that moment rather than the outcome of his actions. "I'm not saying what happened was right," Robert said, "but we have to consider whether Miller really believed he was in danger." The jury deliberated through the weekend, carefully examining every aspect of the case. They reviewed Miller's personnel file, which showed multiple complaints about his behavior over the years. They discussed the expert testimony about police procedures and use of force. And they spent considerable time talking about whether Miller's actions showed the kind of premeditation required for a first-degree murder conviction. Outside the courthouse, supporters of both David and Miller maintained their vigils. Military families had organized prayer circles, while police officers held their own gatherings to show support for their colleague. The contrast between the two groups was stark and emotional, representing the deep divisions this case had created in the community. Rachel Thompson spent the weekend at home with Katie and Michael, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy while they waited for the verdict. David had barely slept since deliberations began, replaying the trial testimony in his mind and wondering what the jury was thinking. What if they don't convict him? David asked Rachel during one of their late-night conversations, "What kind of message does that send to every police officer in America? That they can shoot military personnel without consequences?" Rachel tried to comfort her husband, but she was struggling with the same fears. The family had been through so much over the past 8 months, and the thought that Miller might escape serious punishment was almost unbearable. On Monday morning, the jury sent a note to Judge Morrison asking to review the personnel files showing Miller's history of complaints. This development gave hope to David's supporters, who saw it as evidence that the jury was taking seriously the pattern of problematic behavior that had led to the shooting. By Tuesday afternoon, after nearly 4 full days of deliberations, the jury finally reached their verdict. The news spread quickly through the courthouse and to the media crews waiting outside. Within minutes, the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and family members from both sides. Judge Morrison called the court to order as Officer Miller stood beside his attorney Patricia Walsh. Miller's face was pale and drawn, showing the stress of waiting for a decision that would determine the rest of his life. Across the courtroom, David sat with Rachel and their children, holding hands and trying to prepare themselves for whatever the jury had decided. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison asked. Thomas Anderson stood up slowly, holding the piece of paper that contained their decision. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the reporters stopped taking notes as they waited to hear the words that would end this chapter of the story. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant Robert Miller guilty." The reaction was immediate and intense. David's supporters erupted in cheers and applause, while Miller's family and police colleagues sat in stunned silence. Rachel grabbed David's hand and squeezed it tightly, tears streaming down her face as she realized that justice had finally been served. Miller himself seemed to crumple as he heard the verdict. His wife, sitting in the front row behind the defense table, began sobbing uncontrollably. The reality that her husband would likely spend the rest of his life in prison was devastating and final. Judge Morrison banged her gavel repeatedly to restore order. "I will have silence in this courtroom," she commanded. "We still have the federal charges to address." The jury had also found Miller guilty on federal civil rights violations, which carried additional penalties and ensured that even if the state conviction was somehow overturned, Miller would still face serious federal prison time. But the most shocking moment came during the sentencing phase 2 weeks later. Under Virginia law, first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances could carry the death penalty, and District Attorney Rebecca Sullivan had decided to seek the ultimate punishment. During the sentencing hearing, David took the stand one final time to deliver a victim impact statement. His words were measured and powerful, describing how the shooting had changed his life and his family's life forever. "Officer Miller didn't just shoot me that night," David testified. "He shot my children's sense of safety. He shot my wife's trust in law enforcement. He shot the uniform that I had worn proudly for 20 years. And he shot the belief that military service members would be respected and protected in their own country." David's statement continued for nearly 30 minutes, and by the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of Miller's supporters seemed moved by the power of his words and the dignity with which he had handled this entire ordeal. The defense brought in Miller's family members to plead for mercy, describing him as a devoted father and husband who had made a terrible mistake. Miller's teenage daughter took the stand and begged the judge to spare her father's life, her testimony heartbreaking in its raw emotion. Miller himself finally spoke during the sentencing phase, offering what seemed like a genuine apology for his actions. "I know that nothing I can say will undo what I did to Lieutenant Colonel Thompson and his family," Miller said, his voice shaking. "I will have to live with the knowledge of what I did for the rest of my life, however long that may be." But Judge Morrison had reviewed all the evidence, including Miller's history of complaints and his behavior during the shooting. When she announced her decision, her voice was firm and clear. "Officer Miller, you took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this community," Judge Morrison said. "Instead, you used your position of authority to commit a violent crime against a decorated military officer who posed no threat to you or anyone else. The aggravating circumstances in this case, including your abuse of police power and the evidence of racial motivation, require the most serious punishment available under law. I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection." The courtroom erupted again as Miller's family screamed in anguish and David's supporters celebrated the verdict. Miller himself sat motionless, staring straight ahead as he processed the reality that he would likely die for his actions that night. As the bailiffs led Miller away in handcuffs, David felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but the price had been enormous for everyone involved. 2 families had been destroyed, and a community had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about racism and police accountability. The death sentence sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across America, serving as a clear message that police officers who abused their authority would face the full consequences of their actions.